It's sort of a process that focuses on introspection. It's the company looking at itself and deciding a couple of things. First, what is their tolerance for risk? What is their appetite for dealing with things that they can't necessarily control completely? And secondly, it's understanding in a company what's most important. What are the business objectives they need to achieve in order to accomplish the things that the business needs, that believes it needs to do? With those two things, what you get is a focus on how aggressive do I need to be at remediating risks, and which direction should I do them? What matters and what doesn't?
What kinds of risk management activities are aligned to business priorities?
In its best incarnation, risk management actually does the alignment for you, because it's the process of saying to a company what's most important to you and how are those things prioritized. And if I do that at the highest levels and connect to that, what are the business processes that realize those priorities? What are the information systems that support that? Even what are the assets used in those information systems? Then I can take something as simple as a virus or a patch and decide, if it's exploited, what's the impact on the business? And that lets me know, what should I patch first? What should I fix first? What should I invest most in mitigating risk, because I understand its impact? If I don't do adequate risk management, the tendency is to patch everything. And of course, that's the most expensive. Or to invest in every protection technology, scattering it everywhere. And because it's not aligned, I do too much in areas that don't matter, and possibly because of that, not enough in the areas that matter most.
So do companies then consider risk, managing risk technology as a business priority then?
There is a mixed bag there. To the degree that they're required to, regulatory compliance, or in order to be able to process credit cards, or in order to say my banking portfolio passes the Solvency II requirements in the EU. In those circumstances, they really have no choice. And so it becomes a business priority because it's a cost of doing business, almost the gate you have to pass. There's a separate level that says, maybe I should go a bit further. Maybe I should pay attention to not just what my auditor is asking about, but what actually matters to me as a company in terms of risks I'm willing to take and risks I believe I need to do something about. And in that, the company gets a much more organic feel for what can I do to mitigate the risks I can't tolerate, and where am I confident enough that I can handle the downside consequences of a risk that I'm not worried about mitigating. I'm going to boldly step out there, accept the risk, and engage fully in the market and doing things. And in that, you may indeed feed innovation. Risk-taking requires stepping out into the unknown just a little bit. So it gets you off of defense to the extent that your risk management process gives you the confidence to understand the potential impact of the unknown. That lets you explore the unknown with a lot more facility and resilience.
How does a business gain widespread recognition of its potential impact on multiple dimensions of the enterprise value?
The issue there is asking the threats question. If I can step back and say, okay, I'm worried about this core business priority. For us, it's our externally facing website because I'm an e-commerce site. I need to be pretty good about thinking, what are the potential threats to this? That helps me define, now what are the risks that I need to pay attention to? The tendency, unfortunately, is to consider that when a threat and the associated risk is too complex, people tend to turn off. They essentially say, I don't know that. I can't put a number on it. Because of that, I'm just going to ignore it and pay attention to the risks I do know about. Unfortunately, those things you can't see are the things that you can't manage. So the tendency to recoil away from the complexity of dealing with some risks is a very bad phenomenon. There's a second almost pathology about thinking about risk that gets in the way. And it's the idea that risks are not always independent. When I think about my website and my competitor's website failing, the probabilities of each of those doing those are pretty independent. This one might go down, that one might go down, and they're independent. Suppose, however, they're hosted in the same virtual hosting facility, and there's a flood, an earthquake, a tornado. In those circumstances, if one goes down, it's 100% probability the other, not so independent anymore. Our systematic need to deal with risk in a fundamental way, in a way that lets us really understand what's there and then respond reasonably to it, is a bit challenged. Our reflexes are not so tuned to dealing with risk in a way that cultivates an actionable consequence.
Are there any risk management positives to pursue an upside business value?
I think they are. We sort of alluded to the idea that if I know where the risks are, I know how to align my investments in mitigation and remediation so I can reduce the costs of dealing with risks. If I also know what are the things most likely to cause me problems, then I know the things that I'm most likely to have to make headroom for in my budgeting process. The reserve I need, if you will. Think insurance companies. Without adequate reserves, if the wrong thing goes wrong, they're out of business, right? So the ability to have your war chest aligned with what are the things that could go wrong represent your ability to cultivate a confidence in facing those uncertainties. So I think those are two key positives. Another positive, of course, is that it's self-aligning. It's the ability to say, I've got lots of managers and they're all dealing with delivering business value in some way. I can hold them accountable for adequately dealing with risk. And if I look back in time, I can say, how good are you at understanding what are the threats and remediating and mitigating for them in the past, letting me know how I need to adjust your predictions, your estimations, your budgeting out into the future. It's possible to close the loop on risk management by seeing how well did it work in the past in order to understand how well do I tune it out into the future. In all of those circumstances, we get continuous improvement, awareness of risk, and capitalization such that we're ready to handle risks when the inevitable, unexpected, or bad thing happens.
I'm speaking to Dennis Moreau. He's the technology strategist at RSA Security and speaker during ZebraCon 2013. And in just a moment, we'll talk about considerations in planning risk management for future implication and also protecting intellectual property. BFM 89.9. Jeff Sandhu here, and with me today in the studio is Dennis Moreau. He's the technology strategist at RSA Security and a speaker during the recent ZebraCon 2013. And we are talking about risk management strategy developments. What are the possible benchmarks that needs to be considered, in developing the company's strategy?
Benchmarks in risk management strategy tend to be around process. They tend to be around the things that we develop a consensus on that tell us what are the things to consider. There are benchmarks, for instance, in considering the adoption of cloud computing and the things you should pay attention to in doing that. There are benchmarks around bring your own device management for the enterprise and the things you should pay attention to there. Those benchmarks give you dimensions to consider. But the thresholds, the degree to which a company feels comfortable turning the risk knob to one side or the other, those are internal. They depend on company governance. And so what we have benchmarks around is what's the process of finding from the board of directors, from the CEO, from the owners, where the tolerance for risk is and where on the consequence side, where is the intolerance for risk? Where does it need to be mitigated? Where does it need to be remediated? So the benchmarks tend to be defined in terms of process and consensus descriptions around framework and dimensions, not so much an absolute bar that says I'm willing to take an 80% risk in my community that a website would be down, if that makes sense.
Are there risk involved while planning their strategy? Do companies need to sort of consider future implications or outcomes?
Well, risk management, right? So there's always the possibility that you can overlook compelling risks. And there is always the certainty that you're not going to identify all possible threats and all possible risks. So there's the risk of the unknown or the unknown, if you will. In those circumstances, there is the process. There is the understanding that there needs to be a degree of agility, that you can't always drive all risk out unless you're willing to spend an infinite amount of money doing so. But within that, managing the risk of risk management processes is about being comprehensive. It's about thinking about, okay, let's identify threats and we're going to get a list of them. Let's prioritize those and decide, we're going to do what's most important, the things we can do something about. And we're not going to ignore the things that are unactionable, risks we can't estimate. We'll simply characterize them and acknowledge they exist. At least that says, I've got an awareness. I can't force a number on everything. Some risks are very complex to compute, but there are many, many, many risks that I can characterize well enough in order to do adequate business planning. So I think the risks are not investing enough or not trusting enough analytic techniques to give me numbers or ranges or brackets around risk and then prioritizing them.
What about protecting business intellectual property? Is this part of a business priority as well?
Well, it needs to be. Intellectual property can be protected in a large number of ways. There are the whole copyright regimes. There are the trade secret regimes, and then there's patent. The one most problematic and changing most rapidly is patent. And it is the universal consensus, or at least the international consensus now, moving to first to file rather than first to demonstrate or innovate. And that has changed things. But what it also means is that I have to now make that part a systematic part of my innovation process. If I don't, then folks looking at what I roll out in technology might indeed try to lay down a patent minefield because they know which direction I have to go and try to assert a tax on my own innovation. In doing so, in responding to this circumstance, what I really need to do is, with a fair bit of discipline, decide on what my innovations are, and as I pursue them, file disclosures so that I am laying down a patent framework. This is not necessarily to keep others away from my sandbox, but instead to have a documented portfolio that lets you negotiate with competitors when they have patents around similar areas, so you have something to negotiate with, and defense against patent trolls, so they don't lay roadblocks in front of you that force you to spend scarce dollars on lawyers in order to do things you were going to do anyway. In those circumstances, IP protection, especially around patents, has gotten more essential. With respect to copyright and trade secret, it's always been essential. If you don't document when you've done things, what you've done, and systematically made sure that all your employees understand their responsibilities, then intellectual property, valuable stuff, can walk right out the door and leave you with no recourse. And that, of course, is highly damaging.
Do you think that too many IPs these days, and it's causing like a downward spiral for innovation?
Well, I think it affects innovation. It affects it because I have to divert resources to deal with laying my own patent portfolio down, potentially defending it, and potentially using it in a negotiated process. And certainly I'm doing that at a time where I might want to have more fingers on keyboard actually doing the innovation. However, real innovation comes from having an immersion in the problem, for understanding the customer problem so viscerally that you have an instinct about what's the next step, what's the right next move, what will work, and what's a waste of time. That's not anticipated by a patent troll who's sitting there looking at your technology vector. That's only anticipated by someone who recognizes the same problem and opportunity to make a positive difference, a compelling, differentiable value offered into the marketplace. So I believe that it's a problem, but it's a friction problem. It's not a roadblock that has stopped innovation. Just look at the rate at which we're looking at all sorts of things we didn't expect being introduced into the marketplace, and the rate of disruption. Old markets, large, powerful markets, being changed significantly by new innovation.
What are some of the best practices when it comes to developing systems to address IP issues and other risk management strategies?
It is embedding into your workflows, into your planning processes, into project management, the honest-to-goodness objective that says, when I have my roadmap plan, one of the items is deal with the process of filing IP patents where that's appropriate, making sure that I'm disciplined about doing copyright notification, making sure I'm disciplined about documenting, disclosing, and making sure my employees know about trade secret. In all of the circumstances, making sure I do the work. And in that circumstance, that best practice is about almost education of the workforce, adaptation of the processes, and then holding it accountable, making it an objective by which performance is managed. You get the behavior you manage in that you measure in large organizations. So if it's not an objective by which I decide you get promoted, you get a raise, you get fired, then you're not going to pay near as much attention to it. Making it a responsibility and one that's measured is precisely the right way to bring it into the organization.
All right, Dennis, thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, I'm delighted.
I've been speaking to Dennis Moreau, technology strategist at RSA Security and speaker during the recent ZebraCon 2013, talking about risk management strategies development, aligning risk management and business priorities, BFM 89.9.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To find more great interviews, go to bfm.my or find us on iTunes. BFM 89.9, the business station.